Laurel Canyon in the 1960s and early 70s was a magical place where a dizzying array of musical artists congregated to create much of the music that provided the soundtrack to those very turbulent times. Members of bands like the Byrds, the Doors, Buffalo Springfield, the Monkees, the Beach Boys, the Turtles, the Eagles, the Flying Burrito Brothers, Frank Zappa, and the Mothers of Invention, of course, Steppenwolf, CSN, Three Dog Night, and Love, along with such singer-songwriters as Joni Mitchell, Judy Collins, James Taylor, and Carole King, lived together and jammed together in the bucolic community nestled in the Hollywood Hills. But there was a dark side to that scene as well, and that's captured in Dave McGowan's new book. Many didn't make it out of there alive. We never hear about those, of course, and many deaths remain shrouded in mystery to this very day. Far more integrated into the scene than most would like to admit was a guy by the name of Charles Manson, along with his murderous entourage. Also floating about the periphery were various political operatives, up-and-coming politicians, and intelligence personnel, the same sort of people who gave birth to many of the rock stars populating the canyon. And all the canyon's colorful characters, rock stars, hippies, murderers, and politicians, politicos to be more exact, happily coexisted alongside a covert military installation.
There were many revelations to me in this book, so let's start with the primary revelation, which was Lookout Mountain Laboratories. Tell us about that.
Lookout Mountain Laboratories was a top secret U.S. Air Force installation nestled up in Laurel Canyon, the existence of which remained unknown until fairly recently, even within the conspiracy community. Very few people seem to be aware of the existence of this facility, which remained operational at least through 1969 officially, and according to other sources, considerably beyond that, but certainly through 1969 during the peak years of the Laurel Canyon music scene, which was, a very curious discovery, to say the least, to find that nestled right in the middle of this bucolic hippie commune, so to speak, was a highly classified military establishment that was in full operation.
When was that built?
It was built World War II years, I believe, initially as a anti-aircraft installation to protect Los Angeles against a possible aerial attack during World War II, and then it morphed into a film studio at some point and was said to be the world's most complete self-contained film studio.
According to most reports, it was initially built as a covert air defense facility, like during World War II.
An old Ajax missile site or something?
Something along those lines, yeah, like the fortifications they have up in San Francisco that were built in that same era. And then it morphed into a covert film studio where they processed all the film stock from the atomic weapons test and
right there in Coldwater Canyon, Laurel Canyon.
What's that?
They processed the film right there in Laurel Canyon.
Yeah.
Oh, they had a lot of other facilities. I wonder why they. That's interesting. Interesting.
Yeah, it was actually said to be the world's only complete self-contained film studio. I mean, they could do everything from soup to nuts, so to speak. They had film vaults, they had sound stages, they had special effects departments.
Yeah.
They had everything they needed to do a complete film in-house from beginning to end. The only studio in the world that at the time that had that capacity. And according to various reports, a lot of the technology that we see today was first developed there. They had it before anyone else. 3D technology and I don't know, various other things.
So you're talking about early Black Ops stuff.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, I mean, technically it was primarily used for like I say, they processed all of the atomic weapons test footage there. In fact, some of it there's actually film stock that has their logo stamped on it. Says, Lookout Mountain Laboratory. And but they also did propaganda film, and they employed some of Hollywood's biggest stars. People like John Wayne and Marilyn Monroe, and big name film directors like Howard Hawks and John Ford, and I don't know, various other people, big names, like Jimmy Stewart, who did work for the facility on a of a classified nature, and none of them ever talked about it, during their lifetime. So we don't really know what exactly it was that they did, but they at times, there were Hollywood luminaries who reported to duty there, doing something. So. Yeah, it's a very interesting facility, to say the least, and the fact that it just so happened to be located literally right in the heart of where the whole 60s counterculture thing, was kind of given birth. Right around this facility.
This all looms over LA and the burgeoning entertainment scene, which takes us to the real point of the story, which is the rock and roll that came out of Laurel Canyon. And certainly the most famous or enigmatic figure to emerge from that scene would have to be Jim Morrison, the Lizard King, the lead singer of The Doors. But he also had a very conspicuous father. Tell us a little bit about Jim and his father and their place in that strange saga.
Yeah, Jim was certainly a larger-than-life figure, to this day, very, very iconic figure. The curious thing about him is that his father was actually a very high-ranking Navy admiral, which that part was known prior to my work on this book. But what I discovered, which had not been previously reported, is that not just was he a Navy admiral, but he just happened to be the Navy admiral who oversaw the Gulf of Tonkin incident. He was the commanding officer of the ships involved in that notorious incident, which of course led immediately to the passage of the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, and then to the full-scale involvement of ground troops in Vietnam, and ultimately the deaths of some 60,000 Americans and countless millions of Vietnamese and Laotian and Cambodian people, all of which was a direct result of this so-called Tonkin Gulf incident, which Jim Morrison's father was a key figure, to say the least, in orchestrating that whole incident that quickly resulted in the U.S. being engulfed in a very, very bloody quagmire over there, and that happened just like within a year or so of the sun emerging on the Laurel Canyon Sunset Strip scene as this larger-than-life icon of the anti-war, peace movement crowd. So there was a very curious juxtaposition there, to say the least, that you have the father sailing off to help choreograph this incident that drug America into this bloody quagmire, and then the son almost simultaneously emerging on the scene as this larger-than-life icon of the anti-war crowd. And never mentioning, of course, who his father was throughout his years of fame. He conspicuously avoided ever mentioning who his father was and what a key role he had played in.
And we can only guess as to why that was, but there's a picture in the book that shows Jim, the young Jim, the collegiate Jim, very clean-cut, preppy almost, with his father on the bridge of the what's the name of the ship?
Bonham Richard, I believe it was?
Bonham Richard, which was the ship in the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Correct, yeah. It was a very much different Jim Morrison, very clean-cut, collegiate, almost unrecognizable. Seeing his father off as he was about to leave, I think sailed out of San Diego for the Gulf of Tonkin, and within a year he had completely transformed himself physically and emerged as this rock star, just out of nowhere. I mean, just an amazing physical transformation and an amazing transformation from someone who had expressed no interest in music whatsoever to, just like overnight becoming this huge international star.
But what blew me away, Dave, Jim died the same day his father gave a speech on the decommissioning of the ship that he was the rear admiral on during the Gulf of Tonkin.
Yeah.
It's almost like both of their missions were done.
Yeah, to some extent, yeah.
There were so many bands that emerged out of the Laurel Canyon scene. And one of the things that we're going to find that is the primary premise of the book is almost all of these bands had within their family background military intelligence, some form of military ties, political ties. I'm going to name some of the bands out of Laurel Canyon because there's so many. The Byrds, The Doors, Buffalo Springfield, The Monkees, The Beach Boys, Steppenwolf, Love, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, The Turtles, The Mamas and the Papas, The Flying Burritos Brothers, The Eagles, America. There was the singer-songwriters, Jackson Browne, Joni Mitchell, James Taylor, Linda Ronstadt, Carole King. It's nuts. Just so people get a grasp of what we're talking about here, I'm going to ask you about a couple of people, and you tell me what their relationship was to these military backgrounds, because some of these people were, I couldn't believe it. Papa John Phillips of the Mamas and the Papas.
He was the son of a career Marine Corps officer who also various other members of his family were very closely tied to the military as well. His mother, his older sister, and his first wife were all career Defense Department employees. So, I mean, pretty much his entire family, everyone around him was a career military person, and he himself was initially prepped for a military career. Not only that, but his first wife was also a direct descendant of John Adams, the second president of the United States, which is another thing that you will find is some of these people, in addition to having a military or military intelligence background, a lot of them kind of come from what we could call like royal sort of blue blood bloodlines, so to speak. That's another commonality that a lot of these people share.
Well, speaking of blue bloods, the most unlikely person, David Crosby, of Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and he was in the Byrds as well.
He was in the Byrds.
Talk about David Crosby, because he's an enigmatic character.
Yeah, he was a Byrd, one of the founding members of the Byrds, the original members, and the guy who emerged as the biggest star. I mean, the name that we remember today. And like a lot of the people, most of the people who emerged from that scene as the big iconic figures, he has a very curious family background. Yeah, his full name is David Van Cortlandt Crosby, and he is a direct descendant of three interrelated families: the Van Cortlandts, the Van Rensselaer, and the Van Schuyler families. And if you look them up, bounce around Wikipedia for a while, you'll find that his family tree includes just people occupying virtually every position of prominence that you can imagine, back to the founding of the country. Revolutionary War generals, Civil War generals, judges, senators, congressmen, governors, just everything short of the president. Various members of his family have occupied for well over 200 years now. Well,
you mentioned in the book that not only did these bands spring up very quickly, but the club scene within Hollywood blew up. All of a sudden, you've got Pandora's Box and these various clubs. I guess the London Fog?
London Fog, the Whiskey A Go-Go, the Kaleidoscope, a whole bunch. I mean, there was a bunch of them, some of which, still remain to this day. The Troubadour, I think, is still there. And the whiskey, is the whiskey still there?
The Whiskey and the Troubadour still exist. But what you're saying is these bands come about very quickly.
Very quickly.
Dubious musicianship initially, but an infrastructure builds up around them.
Correct, yeah.
Clubs to play, venues to play, a radio station to play their music. The record labels, usually not ones to immediately fork out some cash immediately, are signing these bands right and left.
Which came first, the music and the hippies, and then the government, or the government and then the music and the hippies?
I believe it's the latter. There's long been debate about the 60s counterculture and whether it was at some point, co-opted, so to speak, and misdirected by the government. But, based on all the research that I've done, I would conclude that it was never legitimate, from the start, that it was created, as a psyop, so to speak, from the beginning, and that everything that grew out of it was, I don't think it was ever the organic, grassroots sort of thing that we're supposed to believe it is.
It almost would lead one to believe that perhaps the players here were either groomed for the positions that they would soon take, or maybe they were duped by the establishment, and one asks themselves, well, to what end? And I believe you make the point, and I buy it, that perhaps the whole hippie movement was largely created, why?
I believe to undermine the budding anti-war movement, which is one of the other. You mentioned one of the great misconceptions is that the hippie movement began life in Haight-Ashbury, which is the 99% of the people. If you ask them that, I'm sure that's what they would tell you. That was the birthplace and the sort of spiritual center of the hippie world, and it comes as a shock to a lot of people to find that it actually began a couple of years earlier right here in LA, because that's just not what most people think of when they think of that era. And the other great misconception is that the hippies were synonymous with the anti-war movement, but that wasn't the case initially. There was a anti-war movement already in existence, primarily on college campuses, that was centered around these very conservative, well-educated, straight-laced college professors, and they're equally
people you might have taken seriously.
Yeah, people that you might have taken seriously, and then suddenly they were replaced with these long-haired, bearded, bead-wearing, slogan spouting, LSD taking, and just, these people who everything about them, from their hairstyles, their clothing styles, their lifestyles, their, the free drugs and free sex and the whole lingo that developed around them just must have seemed, these people might as well have been from Mars to, people in mainstream America. And I grew up idolizing them and wishing that I had been born sooner so that I could have been one. But at the same time, I can see how that would be a much less effective face to put on the anti-war movement than what was originally on there. And there are quotes from people who were part of the original movement questioning whether, is this some kind of a government operation? Where are all these hippies coming from all of a sudden? And
well, Dave, we're talking about all these enlistment age young men, lots of drugs, lots of sex, underage girls. A, did any of these guys get drafted? B, did any of them do any time? Because, all of this is going on in plain view.
Yeah, that's another big clue that this may not have been. If these people were enemies of the state who were a thorn in the side to authorities and stuff, then the state had vast resources to bring them under control, and it wouldn't even have required very heavy-handed tactics. There was a draft in place. That's what the whole counterculture was all about, was opposition to the draft largely. And most of these people making the scene were draft-age young men. Yes. And yet none of them had their careers in it, not one. Not even like some minor player, like some long-forgotten drummer for the Turtles or something. I literally could not find a single case of any of the Laurel Canyon musicians who had their careers interrupted by the draft, which is pretty remarkable given the time.
Incredible.
And this was an era when the country had very harsh drug laws, and these people were not only openly using drugs, in some cases they were openly trafficking drugs. Yes. And again, they never got anything more than a slap on the wrist, if that, and consistently walked away from what should have been very, very serious charges with a slap on the wrist at most. So, you know, like I said, again, the state had the tools in place to rein these people in if they were, in fact, you know, becoming a thorn in the side to the status quo, but yet they were allowed to, you know, do their thing.